The religious like to pretend that it's our job to prove that God doesn't exist, rather than their job to prove that he does, because they already have blind faith that he does, and that's really all they care about. Feelings, emotions, wishful thinking. Proof? Yeah, not so much. So let's go see another theist making a desperate attempt and failing miserably. Because what else is new? Let's go look at another supposedly scholarly article, this time written on the Word on Fire website by Matt Nelson, as he desperately tries to justify his belief in his imaginary friend by making unsupported claims and pretending that atheists just have to be wrong. You know, typical theist nonsense. But it remains a fact that they are simply misusing philosophy because it's the only thing they can get even close to wrangling into supporting their side. Honesty is not the strong suit of the religious. So, let's get into it. Although it is rooted in a caricature of the kalam cosmological argument's first premise, whatever begins to exist has a cause, it is a positive argument for atheism, and it does attempt to deal with the God hypothesis in the only arena where God's existence may be decisively confirmed or refuted, the arena of philosophy. Except it isn't a caricature. It's accurately representing the claims made in the kalam and pointing out just how utterly indefensible they are. And you note that he points out that the only arena that they're willing to use, philosophy, yet as I've shown many times before, philosophy is useless for what they want to use it for. It's simply all they have left once science and other methods of rationally coming to conclusions have completely failed them. The God defended by Christian theists is a transcendent, eternal, and spiritual being. He is the one creator of all physical reality and existed before all of time, space, matter, and energy. Being outside of the natural world, God cannot be discovered nor refuted by science alone. For this reason, the arguments for and against God's existence must be, in the end, philosophical. Except they don't want to talk about the fact that every single one of those characteristics are just arbitrarily assigned to their imaginary friend. How do they know that God is transcendent? How do they know that he's eternal or spiritual? How do they know any of the things that they claim to know? What objectively verifiable methods can they demonstrate for any of these supposed claims? The answer, of course, is none. They have no means of showing that any of these claims have any objective intellectual validity. It's just wishful thinking on their part. It's no different than me declaring all of the characteristics I personally like about invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies. What does that actually mean without some means of verifying that my description is accurate? Not a damn thing. He then goes into Lawrence Krauss and disassembling the kalam, which you can read for yourself if you're interested, and the link is in the description below, but I've done this many, many, many times before. The kalam makes irrational, non-demonstrable claims as if they were factually true, then arbitrarily makes God exempt from the rules so that he can be the conclusion that they were shooting for the whole time. See any of the videos I've done on kalam for more information. It's blatantly dishonest that they keep ignoring the valid criticism of their positions. So, we're going to jump down to their 3 made-up omni-properties and see what they have to say. They simply declare that these things are real without having any means whatsoever to demonstrate that they are. So here we go with omniscience. Now let's consider God's omniscience. God knows all truths and accepts nothing false as true. But could an all-good God know what it is like to sin? Yes, for God knows all truths, but he doesn't know all truths directly from personal experience. God knows what it's like to sin by knowing what it's like for us to sin. Now, if God is all-knowing, if he knows everything that every person will ever do, what does that mean for our free will? Is such casual liberty an illusion? Not at all. I can know my influenza-stricken gagging child is about to vomit without causing her to vomit. Foreknowledge does not equal causality. Yeah, except that doesn't make any sense coming from people who push the idea of absolute causality. Remember, we're talking about kalam. God set up the whole system, knowing full well where absolutely everything would end up with unerring accuracy. He knows where every atom began and where every atom will end, and every single interaction that atom will have for billions and billions and billions of years. Therefore, God would know that a gagging child would be stricken. He would know exactly when and exactly under what conditions it would happen. He'd know about every person who's going to die tragically. He'd know about everything from the moment of first existence to the moment of the last. Yet God does nothing to stop any of it. And that makes God a dick. He has the power and the knowledge to change it, yet he simply does not. Please, Matt, you worship this asshole. Why? This brings us to the claim of God's omnipotence. Is there any philosophical contradiction that can be drawn out of God's infinite power? As we have noted, God cannot sin because he is morally perfect, the perfect standard of what it means to be good. Thus, God has the power to do all logically possible things. That is, he has the power to do all meaningful things. That is why he cannot create a four-sided triangle, which is really nothing at all. Nor can God create a rock that is too heavy for his all-powerful self to lift. Such a notion is meaningless because it fails to acknowledge how God really is. A bachelor cannot forget his wife's birthday because he is a bachelor. God cannot be overpowered by any creature because he is omnipotent. Well, at least they recognize that this is just a claim, not a demonstrated fact, but it doesn't stop them from pretending that God actually is omnipotent in every demonstrable way. It's like claiming that Harry Potter really is the chosen one. It's patently absurd. Yet this all falls apart completely because they claim God is omnipotent and then argue that God has limitations on what he can do. That is not what the definition of omnipotence says. God cannot be limited by morality because God can just change what morality means on a whim. God can suspend physics anytime he wants. God is not bound by any rules or laws that he doesn't want to be bound by. If he is, then by definition, he cannot be omnipotent. And keep in mind, this is all something that they're just yanking straight out of their ass. They haven't shown that actual omnipotence actually exists. This is the failure of their beliefs and why they can only rely on philosophy to bail them out. Philosophy uses the tools of logic and reason to analyze the ways in which humans experience the world. Yet that says nothing about what actually is. As I've said before, you can't tell me anything about the existence of a new species of wombat using philosophy. Yet they're trying to do exactly that with God. It simply doesn't work that way. Finally, what about God's omnipresence? How can this be so? Well, as long as God is unbound by time and space, there is no contradiction. Not only has God created all things, but also his presence is necessary to sustain them in being, just as the presence of hydrogen atoms is necessary to sustain water in being. God is present to all beings, but he is not all beings. That's pantheism. He is present to all things, and the existence of all things is dependent on his presence, just as the caller of a square dance is present to the dancers on the floor, and the existence of the square dance depends on the mind and voice of the caller. All right, this is just a bald rationalization, not anything based remotely on reason. It says, so long as God is unbound by time and space, yet they have not demonstrated that it's actually so. It's like saying that so long as those pixies are invisible and intangible, yet we have no reason to think that they are, or that they even exist. You can't just invent characteristics for something that you've never actually demonstrated out of thin air and demand that it has to be true because it makes you happy. That's asinine. This is just a series of bald assertions with nothing at all to back any of it up. Who says that God created all things? How do you know that? Where did you get that information? And how did you test it to find out if it actually is true? These are questions that have to be asked, and faith doesn't provide any worthwhile answers. It's why none of these things are addressed to skeptics. They're only meant for the already religious, the people who are going to accept these unsupported claims and not ask any questions. Yet that's not very useful in philosophy, is it? I wonder why they do it. Oh, right, because that's all they can really do. Thus God, who contains all perfections within himself, can rightly be referred to as all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing, etc. We cannot say, by the way, that God is a preeminently peerless stinker, contrary to the charge of Dr. Dawkins, because stinkiness is a privation of a good, but God is perfectly good. Such an assertion of God's infinite stinkiness is an amusing bit of rhetoric, but it does not in the least follow logically from the given philosophical definition of God. It betrays Dawkins' misunderstanding of who God is. No, it's pointing out that you have no rational basis for making these claims about who you think God is, because you have no way of showing that God is at all, or that you have any rational means of understanding anything about the supposed God of yours. That's the question that really matters, and the question that the religious refuse to address. How did they come to any of these conclusions? How did they test them to see if they were accurate? And why should we take any of their claims seriously? Yet they have no answer for any of these. It suffices to say that philosophical proofs for or against God's existence will not be sufficiently worked out without rigorous intellectual groundwork. Indeed, the finite limits of human reason that force us into analogies and negative statements about God can sometimes lead to frustration and headaches. But I side with G.K. Chesterton, who acknowledged the riddles of God are more satisfying than the solutions of man. Well, of course you do, because you're going to side with the people who agree with you, whether or not they are any more rationally valid than you are. I really don't care who you side with. I care what you can actually prove. And we all know that you can't prove anything. It's why philosophy doesn't actually mean anything when it comes to religious claims. Science fails them, but so too does philosophy. It doesn't do what they want it to do, so they misuse it and pretend that their blind faith means something that it simply does not mean. The reality is, proofs for or against God's existence will not be worked out using philosophy at all. It will only be science, with its objectivity and repeated testing, that will determine if God is real and what characteristics a real God might have. Philosophy will have no part in it at all. it isn't the right tool for the job, yet it is the only tool that the religious have. That's kind of sad, isn't it?